A laboratory in Scotland had just announced the unthinkable: a sheep had been cloned from an adult cell. Not from an embryo, not from a failed experiment. A true genetic copy of another living being. And what seemed like science fiction suddenly became front-page news. But behind that experiment was a restless mind, determined to challenge the limits of what biology considered possible. His name, Ian Wilmut. And although many remember him for Dolly, the most famous sheep on the planet, few know the complex story of how he got there and how his experiment opened a door that, even today, we might not be ready to cross: human cloning. Decades before the announcement that would shock the world, scientists were already toying with the idea of copying life. In the 1950s, a pair of researchers managed to clone frogs. It was a milestone, yes, but still very far from mammals. The path toward cloning was an uncertain one, full of failures, ethical doubts, and technology that wasn't ready. For years, cloning an adult animal was considered almost impossible. Differentiated cells, like those from the skin, muscle, or liver, had already taken on their function. It was thought that they couldn't be reset to once again become the origin of a whole organism. Ian Wilmut didn't believe that. At the Roslin Institute, near Edinburgh, Wilmut and his team were working on improving the genetic engineering of farm animals. They wanted to produce sheep with specific traits, even ones capable of generating medicines in their milk. But secretly, they were also exploring something even more ambitious: somatic cell nuclear transfer. The name sounds complicated, but the idea was as simple as it was revolutionary. Take the nucleus from an adult cell, the brain, where all the DNA is, and insert it into an egg cell from which its own nucleus had previously been removed. Then, stimulate that egg so it would start dividing, as if it were a normal embryo. That was cloning. And no one had ever succeeded in doing it with a mammal before. After 277 failed attempts, Dolly was born. An apparently normal sheep, with white wool and a calm gaze. But her existence was anything but ordinary. Dolly was an exact copy of another adult sheep, cloned from a mammary gland cell. The name was no coincidence. It was in honor of Dolly Parton, the American singer, because the cell came from mammary tissue. A humorous nod within a historic achievement. But beyond the anecdote, Dolly changed everything. In February 1997, when Wilmut's team announced her birth to the world, the response was immediate. Front pages, headlines, press conferences. The world was both celebrating and trembling. Because if it was possible to clone a sheep, what would stop someone from cloning a human being? The scientific community was divided. On one hand, there were those who saw cloning as an incredible promise, curing genetic diseases, saving endangered species, producing organs on demand. On the other hand, deep fears emerged. What if governments or private labs started cloning people? Where would identity, individuality, the soul, be left? Wilmut, aware of the power of what he had unleashed, was clear from the start: this is not about cloning human beings. It's about understanding how life works. But it was already too late. The door had been opened, and humanity was looking toward an uncertain future. Dolly grew up like any other sheep. She lived in a pen, grazed in the fields, and became the mother of 6 lambs. But she was constantly watched, analyzed, photographed. Her body, her behavior, her health, everything was closely monitored. In 2003, at 6 years old, she began to show symptoms of arthritis. Later, she developed a progressive lung disease. The veterinarians made a difficult decision to euthanize her. Dolly died young. Very young for a sheep. And that set off a new alarm. Do clones age faster? Years later, other animals were cloned: cows, cats, dogs, even horses. but Dolly remains a symbol. A before and after in the history of biotechnology. A creature born in the lab that forced all of humanity to face an uncomfortable question: how far are we willing to go with the power of science? Dolly's death not only closed a chapter, it also fueled the fire of global debate. There was no turning back. Cloning was no longer just a theoretical possibility. It was a tangible reality and, for many, a disturbing one. Governments around the world began to take action. Some nations rushed to ban any experiment that could involve human cloning. Others pushed for broader laws, regulating all forms of genetic manipulation. But there was something those laws couldn't stop: human imagination. While the world debated limits and ethical boundaries, there were those who dreamed beyond them. Cults, radical scientists, media personalities. All of them saw in Dolly not an end, but a starting point. One of the most controversial was Clonaid, an organization linked to the aliens, a movement that claimed humanity had been created by extraterrestrials through genetic engineering. In 2002, they claimed to have cloned a girl named Eve. They never presented any evidence. The scientific community dismissed it as a hoax. But the mere fact that a group dared to proclaim such news spoke to the magnetism that cloning had unleashed and the fear that continued to grow. At the same time, figures like Dr. Panayotis Zavos emerged, a Cypriot American researcher who claimed to have been actively working on human cloning. According to him, it was not only possible, but imminent. One of his statements stuck: human cloning is already here. The question isn't whether it can be done, but when we'll accept that it will be done. The scientific community called him reckless, but his presence in the media fueled an old fantasy: the possibility of defeating death. Imagine for a moment that someone loses a loved one and is offered the chance to bring them back. Is that a comfort? Or is it a way of desecrating the mystery of life? That tension between scientific progress and ethical dilemmas has always been present throughout modern history, but with Dolly, it reached a new level. Because for the first time, it wasn't about a philosophical theory or an abstract laboratory experiment. It was a real, living sheep. And behind her, the threat or promise of replicating a human being. Ian Wilmut never wanted to go that far. In fact, after the success with Dolly, he began to speak out openly against human cloning. He became an advocate for therapeutic cloning, the kind that aims to regenerate organs or tissues without creating a complete individual. For Wilmut, the real value lay in regenerative medicine. The possibility of using stem cells to cure neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's or to rebuild organs without relying on donations. And even though his vision was more cautious, he knew he had unleashed something impossible to stop. Dolly was not just a scientific achievement. She was a mirror. A mirror in which we saw reflected our ambitions, our fears, and our deepest questions about what it means to be human. What would happen if someone cloned a person just to use them as an organ donor? And what if a government decided to manufacture genetically identical soldiers? Would they have a soul? A conscience? Rights? No one had the answers. And even today, more than 2 decades later, we still don't have them. Dolly's image became a cultural icon. She appeared in documentaries, books, t-shirts, even in art exhibitions. Her body was preserved and embalmed, and today it's on display at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. Thousands of visitors stop in front of her every year, some out of curiosity, others out of respect, and others out of unease. She's not just a sheep, she's the tangible evidence of a turning point in history. But there's something else that makes Dolly fascinating. She wasn't created to control the world or to challenge the limits of nature. At its core, she was a precision experiment, a logical step in the evolution of science. And yet, her existence forced millions of people to rethink beliefs, religions, philosophies, and laws. All because of a creature that didn't even understand the impact she had just by existing. In the years that followed, many other clones would be born. But the emotional impact of Dolly was never replicated because she was the first and, in a way, it was the last time humanity faced itself in the mirror with eyes so wide open. Dolly's legacy isn't measured only in scientific publications, or in conferences, or even in later clones. It's measured in the echo she left in our collective consciousness. Because after Dolly, the question stopped being whether we could clone and became whether we should do it. Cloning opened up fascinating doors. Today, decades later, genetic engineering has evolved at a dizzying pace. We have the CRISPR tool, capable of editing genes with a precision that was once unthinkable. There are labs that clone pets on demand and scientists working to bring back the woolly mammoth or the dodo. We live in an era where bringing extinct species back to life is no longer just a science fiction fantasy. But it all started with Dolly, that calm, quiet sheep whose body held one of the most powerful secrets in the universe, the possibility of duplicating life. What disturbed many people the most wasn't the fact that a living being could be copied. It was the idea that, at some point, we could use that technology to replace someone. A lost son? A genius? A dictator? The human soul resists the idea of being replicated as if we were objects. But science, sometimes, does not wait for the soul. In the midst of this whirlwind, Ian Wilmut made an unexpected decision. Years after his great achievement, he stepped away from the laboratories. In an interview, he confessed that if he could go back, he wouldn't repeat the experiment. Not out of regret, but because of something deeper. He had realized that the real breakthrough isn't in replicating life, but in improving the life we already have. Since then, he devoted himself to researching stem cell therapies. He was no longer trying to create new creatures, but to yield the ones that already exist. That change in direction is perhaps the most powerful lesson Dolly left behind. In 2018, Wilmut revealed that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And instead of hiding, he used his voice to advocate for stem cell research. Ironically, his own health depended on the scientific advances he himself had driven, but this time not as a pioneer, but as a patient. The science that once shaped the world now became his personal hope. A perfect circle. And a painful one. Dolly was unique. And not because she was cloned, but because she started a global conversation that is more alive than ever. Today, we still don't have all the answers. Is it moral to clone animals to feed the world? Should we bring back extinct species? Where is the line between scientific progress and preserving our humanity? Maybe those answers won't come soon. Or maybe, deep down, it's not about answers, but about asking ourselves the right questions. Every technological advance brings with it a shadow, and it's up to us to decide what to do with it. Dolly was a laboratory creation, yes, but she was also a symbol, a beacon in the fog of the unknown. Thanks to her, we learned that DNA is not just a code, it's a story. A story that we can read, edit, and perhaps rewrite. But before we play with the keys of creation, we must understand what it means to be authors. It's not enough to know how to spark the flame of life. We must have the courage and humility to ask ourselves why we should ignite it. Today, in the National Museum of Scotland, Dolly rests embalmed inside a display case. She doesn't move, she doesn't breathe, she doesn't feel. But those who stop to look at her don't just see a sheep, they see a turning point. A moment when humanity crossed an invisible threshold, where science and ethics collided, and where a small creature, unaware of her own fame, forced us to look inward. Because deep down, Dolly's experiment wasn't just with genes, or eggs, or cells. It was an experiment with the human soul. And its consequences are still being written.